and I don't remember if it's volume 1 or volume 2, but it's from Dixie, where she's quoted as saying, "Oh, Bing lets those kids get away with murder."
Yes. No, that's right. And also, a lot of that was in the transcripts. You see, when Bing was interviewed for Call Me Lucky, Dixie was alive. So there was a lot more about Dixie in the transcripts.
They were still married, yeah.
But then, well, they remained married, but then she died several months before the book was due to come out. And a lot of it he just wouldn't allow in the book at that point, but they were still in the transcripts. I mean, he keeps saying, you know, Dixie thinks I'm like the cream puff of the world. I'm too liberal, you know. And Philip really went into the corporal punishments that she did. And then I went back to my interviews with Gary, and I found this amazing story that he told me about her making him cut down a birch branch, and it couldn't be too limber, and then she would use it on him. So, I mean, there was a lot of things going on in that family that were very, very hard to deal with.
Oh, the story that gave me chills, I think it's early in volume 2, and this is not just an isolated incident, but Bing comes home from a hard day of making movies, which is not an easy thing to do, and he's exhausted, and night after night he would come home and find Dixie soused to the gills, terrorizing the kids, you know, if not actually beating them, but, you know, terrorizing them, you know, being drunk and unruly in front of them, and just...
Well, then there were the housekeepers. There was one housekeeper that Gary said nearly drowned us. Her punishment was to bring the kids into a bath and submerge them. And fortunately, one day, Dixie walked in and she saw it. And Gary, this was his favorite moment of his mother. She kicked that woman out of the house so fast that she wouldn't even let her pack. She told her she could send someone around for her things. And things sort of eased up after that. But at that point, Bing heard about it and realized that there was a real issue. So then he hired the infamous, what's her name, Georgie Hardwick, who really terrorized them, but was very close to Dixie and kept a very firm handle on the family. And in fact, the kids were very, very fond of her initially. Gary turned against everybody, but Philip thought she was a saint and paid for her nursing home cares until she died. Interestingly, after Dixie died and Bing married Catherine, Catherine referred to Georgie as Mrs. Danvers. She really despised her, and she said to Bing, you know, Dixie's been dead for 5 years, and she still thinks she's working for Dixie. So Bing fired her, and guess who hired her a week or two after Bing fired her? Sinatra.
No.
Yeah, and Frank Jr. and Nancy had exactly the same parallel responses to her that Gary and Philip had. Frank Jr. thought she was like a nun. She was a saint. He loved her. She was such a wonderful woman. And Nancy was not only terrified, but absolutely hated her. I called Nancy once and I said, she wouldn't take my calls initially. I said, I don't want to talk about your father. I want to ask you about your housekeeper. So she took the call, and I said, I hear a lot of stories about Georgie Hardwick. I know she went to work for you, and there was this long pause. And she said, all I will say is that she was very, very tough.
Wow.
And she said, does that tell you what you need to know? And I said, I guess so.
Well, the amazing thing, as Gary has told you, I've been immersed in Crosby since I was a wee lad, and since I had hair, and I read every book, listened to every radio show, heard everything on Crosby. I've been totally immersed in it. And when I get a new biography of somebody I know really well, I say to myself, I'm going to read it, and if I learn one or two things I didn't know before, that's pretty good. For me, that's worth reading a 500-page book to learn, a couple of new things. But especially in Volume 2, there's just, like I say, this pages and pages about the dynamic between Bing and Dixie and the four boys.
Thank you. I just remember what the thing with Carol. Bob and I were talking about footnotes, and he had just finished the fourth volume of Lyndon Johnson, and he said, "Now is the worst part. I got to do the footnote, the notes, source notes." And when I finished the first volume, the source notes was such a pain because they were all over the place, and usually I could remember exactly, and I had made some notes, but there were a couple that took me like days of going through stuff just to find it because I wouldn't use anything I couldn't source. The second volume, I became more adept at using Word. So what I did was I started putting in the source note as I wrote every sentence, and it was an amazing experience because it totally keeps you honest. Because sometimes you're like tempted to speculate or to go over a little bit, but if I couldn't absolutely source it, I didn't go there, and I think it tightened up the writing, but it also did all the things you're talking about. I was insistent on nailing down what could be known. And one of the things that biographers often talk about, for years, 5 years I was directing the Leon Levy Center for Biography, and Caro and other great biographers, and we would sit around and we would talk about the difficulties of biography. And one of the main things that you have to learn is to understand and respect what is unknowable. Biographers can be very arrogant about it. You begin to feel that if you persist long enough. I mean, Caro's a guy who moved his family to the worst poverty-stricken part of Texas for 3 years because nobody would talk to him unless they felt that he had lived there and understood their lives. And he lived there for 3 years. I never had to do something that extreme, but you just, at some point, this is where the door closes, and you have to respect that. One of my favorite filmmakers is Lubitsch, and one of the things I love about Ernst Lubitsch's films, all the great ones are sex comedies, is that the basic understanding that basically everybody has the same sex, everybody's the same in bed. Where everybody's different, where the story is in the seduction. It's what goes on before bed. And in Lubitsch's films, always there'll be this incredible scene between, Jeanette MacDonald and Marie Chevalier, whoever the lovers are, and then they walk into the bedroom and the door closes and the camera stops. It does not go through the door. Lubitsch doesn't think that's his business or yours. And with biography, there are just places where I hate biographies that speculate, that say he may have thought, or perhaps this, or possibly, or they get all Freudian and try to analyze things that they can't possibly know, or they get inside the subject's head and tell you what he was thinking, which you can never possibly know unless he kept a journal and told you what he was thinking. So that idea of footnoting as you work, to me was a tremendous corrective, because every time I was even tempted, I would say, "Can I prove this?" No, I don't have that, but I have this. And sometimes you're still speculating on your sources because you never trust anybody. I have to have everything corroborated, especially if it's negative. The volume 2 begins with this incident that Will was basically alluding to, of Bing coming home and she's berating the very small kids arrayed in front of her, and she's clearly a bit soused. And Gary told me the story, but what really did it for me, what really made me believe the story and look further into it, was that he described Bing walking into Dixie's dressing room where they all were, and walking down, into the dressing room, there were these 3 very, very shallow steps that an adult wouldn't even notice, because you would just, in one step, you would go off into the room. But a little kid who was 6 years old, who used to sit on this step, or who was sitting across from it, would remember that there were 3 treads, and that Bing he just saw him step over, and how he walked over to Dixie without saying a word, and and very gently picked her up and carried her into the next room, and then came back to assure them that she was all right. That was a picture of Bing that I'd never seen before, and it came from Gary, who is so angry at Crosby for much of going my way, of going my own way, his book. At one point, I asked him about this terrible story he tells, and he said, "Oh, man, I don't remember. That was..." And I said, "But Gary, it's in your book. It's what a lot of people think about." If you read the book, incidentally, a motif is, Bing took me to a recording session and I screwed up and I knew he was gonna, beat the hell out of me, but he didn't. Or I knew he was gonna get upset with me, but he didn't. It happens throughout the book. But this is one of the incidents where Bing really took a swag at him. And he said, "I don't remember. I was drinking then. I can't remember stuff when I was drinking." So I called Ross Firestone, who basically wrote the book. And he said, "Yeah, it's true. Gary couldn't remember a lot of that stuff." I said, "So where did you get it from?" He said, "Well, I interviewed his wives." I said, "His wives weren't there then. He wasn't married when he was 8 years old. What do you mean you interviewed his wives?" And he said, "Well, he told them stories, and then I realized, that I didn't have to, tip around gently, because a lot of this book was just nonsense." The worst story I heard about Bing and Gary, I learned from Jack Haley Jr. Gary, it was so painful, couldn't even remember it. He just put it out of his head. So you have to try to corroborate everything. I could give you many examples of that, but...
Oh, God. One thing I'd love for you to talk about, and again, one of the most amazing sections of the book is, as Gary alluded to, I always wanted to know more about the USO tour, that Bing and Fred Astaire's adventure. While in Europe, he crosses paths with both Glenn Miller, Dinah Shore, and Fred Astaire, not to mention the entire Nazi army, but I'll let you talk about that. Yeah. And George Patton, yeah.
There were 2 chapters about the overseas tour. One is London and one is France. And I had written those chapters. I mentioned this new editor there, and he was asking me for chapters as I finished them to get me to finally finish the goddamn book. So I was bringing them and I brought him these 2 chapters, and I hated them. They were terrible. I was really unhappy with them. I worked harder on them than anything, and the reason I worked so hard on them is because I had no material at this point. I hadn't yet found a journal. And I had done things, Debbie and I had gone to Normandy, and I had walked some of the areas where he was, and I made all these maps, and I have friends in France that I talked to, and there were some French newspapers that I was able to get partly translated that covered certain stops that he made, but there was basically nothing. It was just guesswork. Nobody really knew what the hell he did. And then the journal came into my life, and I called my editor up and I said, I think at that point there were chapters 15 and 16. In the actual book, I think they're like chapters 20 and 21, but I said, I'm tearing those chapters up. He said, "Well, you're not tearing them up, you're gonna rewrite, right?" I said, "No, I'm tearing them up. They're all bullshit, and I have the real stuff right now." I was speculating, I was going with, rumored stuff. Now I can actually nail down the source of the rumors and show that they weren't true. I put all the rumors in a series full of urban myths about Bing Crosby. The ones that clearly had no basis in fact. Like, for example, George Patton's biographer, whose name I'm blanking on now, says that Patton was so upset that Crosby went into, accidentally, enemy territory, and that he would walk around with a fatigue hat instead of a helmet, and he was going to have him, I don't know what, he was going to bring some kind of charge against him. And, now I have letters between Patton and Crosby that are quite the opposite. Patton was nuts about Bing and looked forward to seeing him as soon as the war was over. His connection to Eisenhower. Bob Caro's only researcher that his whole life is is his wife, his wonderful wife, Ina Caro. And the first time I met them, Ina said to me, "Have you gone to the presidential libraries about Crosby?" And I said, "Actually, I went to Hyde Park because a lot about FDR, but no, it never even occurred to me." And she said, "Well, you should, and especially Eisenhower, Nixon." And so I did. I called them and I said, "You know, I'm Gary Giddins, I'm writing a book on Ben Crosby and anything, the correspondence that might exist between him and not President Eisenhower, blah, blah, blah." And they said, "Yeah, took your notes, we'll get back to you." And months went by and nobody ever got back to me. And I ran into Ina at a party and she said, "Did you call the libraries?" And I said, "I did, but nobody ever got back to me." And she said, "Did you use my name?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, call them back and use my name." So I called back the Eisenhower guy and I said, "Hi, it's Gary Giddins. Ina Caro suggested Ina? How is Ina? I haven't spoken to her. What do you need?" And within 3 days, I had the complete, a file of Eisenhower and Crosby. And including stuff about when they first encountered each other during the war. So, biographies have their own timeline. If you rush them, you abuse them. And sometimes you just have to wait until the material comes to you. There were two women who were very close to Crosby who I tried for years and years when I was writing the first book to interview, even though they wouldn't have been mentioned in the first volume because they come in the story later. But I was doing all my research then, and they were certainly on my list, and I just couldn't get anywhere with them. And every few years I try again, and now I'm writing the second volume, and I figure one more shot. And this time, both of them were happy to talk to me. And I said to one of them, "What changed?" And she said, "Well, my husband died." She said, "I just thought it would make him feel bad if I started talking about my relationship with Big. But now he's gone and there's no reason not to." And the same was with the other one. The reason I have so much great stuff on Joan Caulfield is because her sister Betty initially said, "This is really personal family stuff and I don't want to talk about it." Who's the actress who won the Academy Award, I think, for HUD? Patricia Neal. She wrote a memoir, and she talks about meeting Caulfield on a boat, and they were both heartbroken because Gary Cooper had broken up with Pat Neal, and Crosby had broken up with Caulfield, and they were both in the same boat, but they couldn't talk about it. And then she made a really vicious comment about Caulfield's mother, who was on the boat, who was protecting her and keeping everybody away. And so Betty Caulfield said to me, the only person who wrote about it was Patricia Neal, who said this terrible thing about our mother, who was such a lovely woman, and she didn't deserve that. And then I said, "Well, everybody is gone now, and if I'm going to tell the story accurately, I need to speak to maybe 2 or 3 people who know something." And she said, "Well, I know, I feel bad about it." But then a day later, she called me up and she said, "You know what? I gave a lot of thought to it, and why shouldn't you have the story?" So I had her sister, and then somebody I met in Minneapolis. His aunt was very close to Caulfield because she lived next door to her in an apartment building. The aunt turned out to be the widow of Schirmer, of Schirmer Music. So she was a very well-connected person. And I went to see her, and I didn't use her as a primary source because she wasn't there, but Joan spilled everything to her. So I was basically able to use her as somebody who gave me a sense of Joan's feeling, how much she loved Crosby and all of that kind of thing. There are different kinds of sources. There's some you feel you can quote. There's some who give you background material, and you sort of have to, find your way into what you believe and what you don't believe.
Last thing, I know you got to go. Just to bring it back to the present, Crosby was a lifelong Republican and a conservative, as opposed to Sinatra, who was a lifelong Democrat and a liberal. But both of them, and it might even be more remarkable in the case of Crosby because he was a conservative, but Well, I don't want to ask you if you think he would have approved of the current president, but anyhow,
Oh
we
my
won't go
God.
there.
Wait a second.
We won't go there.
He would have been appalled. I mean, he was a man who really believed in truth. He really believed in a certain kind of basic decency. He was a lifelong Republican, as you say, but he despised Nixon. People said, oh, he supported JFK because they were Irish. No, it wasn't that simple. His brothers were all Nixonites. No, he was against the war in Vietnam, which he came out in the Wall Street Journal. He was lifelong in favor of the legalization of marijuana. And the thing that really endeared me most to Crosby, and this was sort of a condition before I was willing, I'd been asked for years to write this book, and I kept saying no. And one of the things that turned me around was his position on civil rights and tolerance.
Yeah.
He was so far ahead of the curve. He was famous in Hollywood for, he was the first guy. There had been white shows with black guests.
Right.
But Crosby was the first who insisted on singing on the air
Treating
with the
black people
Mills
like
brothers.
equals. Yeah.
And Anthony Quinn, I'll never forget, said to me, he said, he adored Crosby. He thought Crosby was one of the greatest actors he'd ever worked with, and that if he had had a different kind of temperament, he could have played anything. He could have played Shakespeare. But what it really came down to for him was, Bing was the first person I ever met in Hollywood who didn't treat me like a Mex.
Wow.
And I would hear this from gay people, his toupee maker, the choreographer for the Christmas shows. Both were openly gay, and they said in those days, you had to be very careful, even though, people knew that we were there. But Crosby would have rehearsals in his home, and he trusted me with his children. This is the second family, and that was very unusual then. They just all said the same thing. Bing was live and let live. And he really did believe. Now, there were limitations. He is a man of his time. Lena Horne said that he was very upset when his pianist Lenny Hayden married Lena. That was interracial marriage was a bridge too far for him then. But she said, who wouldn't it have been? I mean, he was really something. When he made Pennies from Heaven, the first film that he produced himself and had distributed through Columbia, he was finally going to be able to work with his idol, Louis Armstrong. And the producer said, what's the point of that? We'll have to deal with that mobster Joe Glazer, who's his agent, and it'll cost us a fortune to bring him in. And Bing said, as he frequently said, this isn't negotiable.
Yeah.
Louis Armstrong's going to be in this film, and he's going to be billed with me on top. Even though, in the end, he was only in the film for 7 minutes. It's the first time a black performer was ever billed on a white film with the stars of the film.
What?
I mean, even now, if you look at a lot of movies where there'll be an important performance by a black entertainer or actor like Clarence Muse or Hattie McDaniel, no matter how big the part is, they'll always be last. Louise Beavers is always the last person on the credit. Not in Crosby films.
One detail which I really relished, even though, again, as Gary says, Crosby was a man of his time, and he mentions there's 3 movies where Bing appears in blackface. Again, not very progressive. But in the black press of the time, they treated Crosby like a hero. And they didn't really mind about the blackface, but it was because Bing, in all the media, in radio, movies, and recordings, treated his black guests like equals. And I was especially moved by the description of Bing's relationship with Paul Robeson, who, of course, was not only black, but he was a Molotov cocktail throwing Stalinist and a communist who could not be further apart from Crosby ideologically, and yet Bing had incredible respect for Paul Robeson, and that really riveted me.
Robeson and Crosby were the 2 guys who recorded Ballad for Americans. Most people remember the Robeson version, but they were both very successful. And in 1940, Ballad for Americans, which was later banned, and it was by communists and all of that, was performed at the Republican presidential convention.
Wow.
So things changed a lot, and Robeson was considered a hero for his work during the war effort. Of course, after the war, everything they took away his passport and all of that. He didn't throw Molotovs, but he was certainly a Stalinist much longer than he should have been. But he was an extraordinary artist, and Crosby adored him and had him on the show. And at one point, there was a lot of backlash simply because he was black, and they got some very nasty letters from a group in Louisiana, and they said, look, they were upset that they called each other by their first names, Paul and Bing. And the letter was, if that so-and-so doesn't call him Mr. Crosby, we ain't gonna buy no more Kraft food. So there was a memo. I mean, I have the memo in which it said that make sure that Bing doesn't call him Paul and Paul doesn't call him Bing. Just take the names out. So Robeson, he took the memo seriously and he didn't use any names. But Bing begins every single line of his dialogue with Paul. Tell me, Paul. And then at the end of the show, he says, and now I'm going to bring out the greatest, singer of our time, Paul Robeson, because we're all standing together. So there were things like that he did that, again, he took no credit for. He didn't boast about any of this kind of stuff. He was just the kind of human being that he was. I'll meet you. My wife has to leave, but I'll have a few moments. What was I going to say? What you just said about the blackface thing. Yeah. The reason why Irving Berlin wrote a song for Holiday Inn, which is the first one that has a blackface in, and it's called what the hell is it called? Abraham, which Berlin and everybody associated with the movie thought was going to be the hit.
The hit, right?
This is the movie of White Christmas. They thought
Holiday Inn.
They thought Holiday Inn, but Holiday Inn is the movie with White Christmas in it.
Came in, right.
So, and they also thought the movie's opening in September. We can't even plug a Christmas song in September. They completely misread the power of that song. But Abraham uses the word, he freed the darkies. So the black press was very upset about darkies. They were not upset that the number was done in blackface. Berlin, to his credit, said, if I had thought it was offensive, I would never have used it. And he ordered the word taken out of every copy of sheet music. Which it is to this day. But of course he couldn't take it out of the movie, it's already there. But one of the reasons they didn't protest blackface is because black entertainers had been doing blackface since the 1870s. And if you've ever seen the great film Stormy Weather, which is an all-black cast, you'll see a couple of legendary black comedians in their dressing room putting on the
Ben
porn.
Carter, right?
Yeah, they were still doing blackface then, so they couldn't really make an attack on it. And then also Wendell Willkie, the amazing liberal Republican who ran against Roosevelt's third term, who Crosby supported. He was very close to the NAACP, and he and the head of the NAACP made a trip to California to argue for not only better roles, not playing just maids and butlers or chauffeurs, but also to have roles behind the camera, which, as we know, did not happen for another 30-some years. And somebody raised the issue of blackface, and the head of the NAACP said, if white people want to pretend they're black, let them. So, the whole perspective on that has changed completely, but it's just not true that everybody who did blackface was even thinking about actual black people. It had become a show business convention. A lot of people who were born in the 20th century who grew up doing it, Bob Hope said the first time he did it, it's because he walked out on stage in New Jersey and was scared to death. He had never played the East before, and an old timer said, tomorrow night, you go out there with cork. And he said it'll give you all the courage you need because you'll feel like you're invisible. And Hope said that's exactly what I did, and that's what happened. You feel like nobody can see you because you've got the mask on. He said I only had to do it at one or two shows, and then I was a different performer. And Donald O'Connor, I will never forget, asked one of the most wonderful people I ever had the privilege of meeting. One of the great things about writing this book was that I got to meet so many people who I, adored as performers and never expected to meet. And now I'm sitting by his pool for the better part of a day, and this is a man who's worked in every aspect of show